Okay, aggressive American masculinity. Yeah. Our third speaker this afternoon is Elizabeth Everton. She's an adjunct professor at Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a learning and development consultant specializing in systems training for Compass Group North America. She has published several articles, including Scenes of Perception and Revelation, Gender and Truth in Anti-Dreyfusard Caricature. That one came out in French Historical Studies. Line and Shadow, Picturing Anti-Dreyfusism in Revising Dreyfus, Art and Law. And thirdly, René Lalique, The Third Republic in Glass, in René Lalique, Enchanted by Glass. She's currently working on a manuscript, National Heroines, Women and the Radical Right During the Dreyfus Affair.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to... In many ways, I'm talking about, certainly I will talk about his direct descendant in the anti-Semitic movement, but I would say that a lot of the kind of violence, both rhetorical and actual, that you see in these anti-Dreyfusards, 2, 3, 4, and in my case 5 years after Maurez's death, has much to do with him and his loaded canes, which the police took a great deal of interest in, and which people continued to use for years because people are terrible. So let's talk. Few historians would dispute the place of the duel within French culture as late as the early 20th century. A site to adjudicate disputes, to restore wounded honor, and to prove one's manhood, the dueling field was hallowed ground at the turn of the century. But what was one to do when that ground proved elusive or even impossible? Today I'm going to talk about a duel that never happened, in large part because common ground could not be found, very literally because the two would-be combatants were both political exiles from France. In 1901, Paul Déroulède, leader of the Nationalist Ligue des Patriotes, challenged André Buffet, the official representative of the pretender, the Duc d'Orléans, to a duel. That Déroulède was living in Spain and Buffet in Belgium, and neither could cross the French border, added an additional layer of complication to the already delicate negotiation of personal affront and political calculation inherent in the conflict. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, the various parties argued, postured, planned, and traveled, finally meeting in Switzerland, only to disperse under official pressure without having fought. As inconsequential as the incident was, it illuminates not only the snarled politics of the post-Dreyfus, pre-Action Française radical right, but also the ways in which cultural practices such as dueling could be adapted, successfully or not, to new realities. So to understand the conflict between Déroulède and Buffet in the spring of 1901, it's necessary to look back more than 2 years to the height of the Dreyfus Affair in the winter of 1898 and 1899, as the reopened case worked its way through an official reinvestigation. Tensions were running high, and little more than a spark could touch off waves of public violence. The sudden, scandalous, I'd be happy to talk about that later, death of President Félix Faure in February 16, 1899, and the election 2 days later of Émile Loubet, president of the Senate, as his successor, proved such a spark. Faure had opposed the reopening of the Dreyfus case, but Loubet supported it, and Dreyfusards supported him. Anti-Dreyfusards did not, as testified by the countless demonstrations, polemics, and caricatures directed at the new president. On February 23rd, the day of Faure's funeral, Déroulède, supported by the Ligue des Patriotes and other anti-Dreyfusard leagues, put this anger into action by staging a coup. The plan was to march with a crowd of League members to Faure's grave in Père-Lachaise Cemetery, on the way intercepting troops dispersed from the state funeral led by a friendly general, Gabriel de Pellieu. Together, these representatives of the people and the army would take the Élysée and the Hôtel de Ville, topple the existing government, and institute a refreshed plebiscitary republic. This didn't happen. None of it happened. A last-minute change meant Déroulède started off with fewer League members than expected, and his anti-Dreyfusard allies turned out in far smaller numbers. Worse still, when the crowd met the army around the Place de la Nation, it was not Pellieu, but another general, Goderic Roger, at the head. Unaware of the plot, and once approached by Déroulède, spectacularly uninterested in participating in it, Roger led his troops back to the barracks. Déroulède grabbed Roger's horse's reins and was ignominiously dragged into the barracks along with his lieutenant Marcel Habert, while the rest of the crowd milled around in the street. Déroulède, Habert, and about 250 other people were arrested. The two nationalist leaders spent the spring in prison, awaiting trial for sedition and inciting disobedience in the military. The Ligue des Patriotes, Ligue antisémitique, Jeunesse royaliste, Ligue de la Patrie française, and, for good measure, the Dreyfusard Ligue des droits de l'homme were all sanctioned for violation of Article 291 of the Penal Code, an obscure and archaic law that forbade associations of more than 20 people. However, the fines assessed were light, and the leagues carried on as usual. Déroulède was acquitted, despite announcing in open court that if freed, he would just try again. Anti-Dreyfusards had by this point become accustomed to lax punishments meted out by a government that, if it did not entirely agree with them, tended to take their side in all things Dreyfus. But their luck was about to turn. After royalists physically attacked Loubet at the Auteuil racetrack shortly after the formal annulment of the verdict against Dreyfus, Prime Minister Charles Dupuy resigned to be replaced by Pierre Waldeck-Rousseau and his government of Republican defense. For the first time, the government was dominated by Dreyfusards, or at least people who were less inclined to ignore anti-Dreyfusard plotting. Over the summer, this new government investigated the possibility that the different anti-Dreyfusard leagues were colluding together against the Republic, which they were. On August 10th, the Council of Ministers decided to arrest the leaders of the principal nationalist, royalist, and anti-Semitic groups, including Déroulède, Habert, Buffet, and Jules Guérin, head of the Ligue antisémitique and protégé of the Marquis de Morez. In September, the Senate was reconstituted as the Haute Cour, a special body with the power to adjudicate cases of treason or grave danger to the state. And on November 4th, 17 royalists, nationalists, and anti-Semites were formally accused of working together to carry out a plot against the state. The February 23rd attempt, derided at the time, was now serious and dangerous. As the new century opened on January 3rd, 1900, Buffet and Déroulède were sentenced to 10 years of exile and Guérin to 10 years in prison. Buffet settled in Brussels, where he was joined the next year by fellow royalist exile Eugène de l'Ursalus, and Déroulède settled in San Sebastian in northern Spain with Habert. Dérouléde's exile was disastrous for the Ligue des Patriotes and French nationalism more broadly. In the absence of its charismatic leader and in the wake of the repression of 1899, the League faltered, losing both financial resources and members. Despite wins in the Parisian municipal elections in May 1900, the League increasingly found itself unable to compete with the larger, more moderate Ligue de la Patrie Française, or later, the Action Française and Action Libérale Populaire. Buffet's presence in France was less critical. As the Pretender's official representative, he was nominally the leader of the royalist movement, but in practice, he wielded little actual authority. The real blow the Haute Cour dealt to the royalist movement was the revelation of just how small their influence was in the landscape of the radical right and of French politics in general. By the time that the upstart Action Française started to make its mark, the Dreyfus-era royalist movement was all but defunct. So it was in this context that what the police dryly termed the Incident Déroulède-Buffet occurred. The precipitating event was a speech given by Déroulède on February 23, 1901, 2 years after the failed coup. Having convened the nationalist Parisian municipal councillors to San Sebastian, Déroulède delivered a barn burner in which he attacked not only parliamentary republicanism, as opposed to his own dissident plebiscitary republicanism, but also his erstwhile allies, the royalists. His coup, he claimed, was intended to save the Republic, not harm it, and this was why it failed, because the night before the coup, at 2 in the morning, Déroulède claimed one of his followers, a man whom he believed to be loyal to the League and the Republic, approached him and asked, "What would you say if the Duc d'Orléans suddenly appeared tomorrow in the midst of your friends?" Déroulède, shocked and angry, responded that he would arrest the Duke himself, saying, "I am a plebiscitary Republican and as hostile to any restoration of the monarchy as I am to the continuation of the parliamentary regime." I march for the Republic. No one will make me a royalist agent despite myself. And if the monarchists and their monarchs want to infiltrate our ranks tomorrow, too bad for them. The next day, the coup failed, their plans having been mysteriously revealed to the government. I swear, Déroulède concluded, that my effort only failed because the royalists understood that I would never allow the Republic to be harmed. This was provoking. Despite Déroulède and the Ligue des Patriotes' diminished place on the political stage, this was big news, and the press devoured it. The royalist newspaper Le Soleil questioned whether the story could even be true, as the Duc d'Orléans would never undermine the army in that way. The nationalist La Patrie published an interview with the current head of the Ligue des Patriotes, Henri Galli, who wondered, perhaps disingenuously, why everyone was so upset. Déroulède had made essentially the same statement in his testimony before the Haute Cour. On March 1st, newspapers printed a statement by Buffet, written and intercepted by the police 3 days before, in which the royalist categorically denied that the Duke had sent an emissary and that the royalists had informed the government about Dérouléde's plans. Indeed, he added, Déroulède himself had testified that he had announced his plan in a speech that in the days before the coup, meaning that the royalists, the government, and anyone who read the newspaper was aware of them. The next day, Charles Maurras attempted to split the difference, suggesting that Déroulède had been betrayed but by someone in his own camp, not a royalist. Speculation was rampant as to the identity of Dérouléde's unnamed interlocutor. A journalist for Le Gaulois asked Déroulède who approached him, but Déroulède persistently refused to name the person. Socialist Jean Jaurès, writing in the Petite République, insisted that it was Guérin who had been revealed to be taking money from the royalists during the Haute Cour proceedings. Guérin hotly denied all allegations made against him, and the press duly reprinted the flurry of increasingly strident and offensive letters he sent to Jaurès over the next week, along with the results of various investigations carried out by La Libre Parole's Albert Monniot into Jaurès' sources, and Dérouléde's multiple denials that Guérin was the man, mostly predicated on the fact that the two of them did not actually speak to each other. By March 2nd, Guérin had challenged Jaurès to a duel, only to be publicly and somewhat embarrassingly denied on the grounds that his lack of courtesy and restraint disqualified him from dueling, as did, incidentally, the fact that he was still in prison. On March 3rd, the press started to report that Déroulède had contacted Galli and another League member, Léon Dumontet, and directed them to travel to Brussels to ask Buffet for me where and when he would be ready to repeat to my face what he has only dared to say from afar. To which Buffet responded, well, you said that from afar as well, because, again, Brussels, Spain. In actuality, the communication must have come close on the heels of the publication of Buffet's statement on March 1st, as Galli and Dumontet, closely watched by the police, traveled to Brussels that very day. Galli and Dumontet, according to one newspaper, considered sending a telegram to the royalist, but decided to see him in person because, quote, Monsieur Buffet was undoubtedly brought up to speed by the evening newspapers, which arrive in Brussels early in the morning. And indeed, Buffet told the Brussels correspondent for Le Figaro that he had initially believed the two nationalists were coming to explain Dérouléde's remarks in person until a contact in Paris had telegrammed him the substance of Dérouléde's communication to Galli as printed in the papers. From this point, the bulk of the reporting and commentary around the incident centered around the potential duel between Buffet and Déroulède. Interviews with both the principals and the seconds, reprinted telegrams and letters, news and rumors about preparations for and logistics of the duel. Running like a red thread throughout these pieces are two interconnected themes, space and motion. Déroulède and Buffet's seconds travel to Belgium and then travel back. Correspondents visit Buffet, Galli, and Buffet's seconds, either in Paris or in Brussels. Writers wonder endlessly where the duel will take place. Not in Belgium because of the country's strict laws against dueling, maybe in Switzerland, maybe in Italy, who knows? Déroulède himself left San Sebastian almost immediately after contacting Galli, traveling with his sister Jeanne and Albert, his constant companion, first to Madrid, then to Barcelona, and from thence to Genoa. According to La Patrie, the nationalist leader was willing to travel even farther, going, in his words, to Switzerland, to Italy, and roaming across all of Europe, so that distance could never be a reason to refuse to meet. If Déroulède was ready to traverse Europe to duel Buffet, the royalists seemed a little less committed. On March 7th, it was reported that the two sets of seconds could not come to an agreement, and so Buffet considered the matter closed. Déroulède's response to the second's failure to come to an agreement was to send Buffet a telegram in which he accused the royalist of trying to escape the consequences of his actions and calling him, quote, a royal liar, royal menteur. In using deliberately offensive language, Déroulède forced Buffet's hand, whereas before the offense had been primarily political in nature, raising doubts about whether a duel was even appropriate. Now it was personal. Now that a duel seemed inevitable, the distance between the two combatants, their seconds, and any possible dueling field became a serious problem. Déroulède had not included his address in the offensive telegram, complicating Buffet's attempts to put his seconds in touch with him. For that matter, Buffet had trouble locating two new seconds. They had to have new seconds because this was technically a different offense than offense number one. So you had to find a whole new group of people willing to watch you shoot at each other. His first choices refused on the grounds that the duel was primarily political in nature, apparently not having read the newspapers. Buffet contacted a complete stranger, the Bonapartist, Paul de Cassignac, so we're getting the whole spectrum of the Anti-Dreyfusards in here, who had defended him in the press. Cassignac duly traveled from his chateau in the country to Paris, then to Brussels, then back to Paris. And it was reported, it was actually reported that the Duc d'Orléans, stung by the royal liar epithet, wished to fight on Buffet's behalf. Buffet denied this, but telegrams intercepted by the police revealed that the Duke did indeed try to step in, and Buffet rebuffed his would-be king in the most daring thing Buffet ever did in his life. To cap it all, rough seas prevented Déroulède from making the trip to Genoa, leaving him stranded in Barcelona. These roadblocks hindered but did not halt the customary and highly ceremonial preparations for an affair of honor. Both Cassignac and Maurice Barrès, who was acting as one of Déroulède's seconds, joked about the difficulties posed by these long-distance affairs. Even as Déroulède chafed at the delay, and Buffet, stung by an even more offensive letter sent by the nationalist leader, dredged up a long-dead scandal, the Norton affair, in which Déroulède lobbed accusations, again, without naming names. There was wild speculation about the location of the encounter, even as Cassignac insisted that nobody beyond the combatants, their seconds, and Déroulède's sister, sitting in a car at a safe distance, would be permitted to attend. Finally, after a last-minute effort by Buffet's seconds to resolve the issue, Buffet left Brussels, Déroulède left Genoa, and the four seconds all left Paris to convene for the duel outside Lausanne, Switzerland. The duel, it was announced, would consist of two shots fired at 25 paces, and Déroulède was very disappointed that it was not going to be more rigorous. The participants were met in Lausanne by swarms of police, journalists, and onlookers. Unbeknownst to them, the participants and the press, the canton's authorities were well aware of the planned duel and had forbidden it. Déroulède and Buffet were under heavy surveillance from the moment they arrived, leading journalists both on the scene and reporting from afar to announce that the duel would have to take place somewhere else. But it was not to be. Telegrams flew on March 15th that the duel had been called off, prompting one friend of Buffet to send congratulations on having escaped an ambush. Combatants and seconds alike left town that day, and the following day, the papers provided more information. Both Buffet and Déroulède had received formal orders of expulsion, requiring them to leave the canton or face imprisonment. After a quick consultation, the seconds issued a statement in which they characterized the duel as political in nature and announced that under these conditions, the undersigned, the seconds, judge that honor has been preserved and declare the matter closed. Buffet left as directed, but Déroulède lingered in Lausanne, unauthorized, for almost 2 additional hours, grumbling to all who would listen that it wasn't worth the effort to come so far. So why did Déroulède come so far? Part of the answer lies, of course, in the waning fortunes of the Ligue des Patriotes and of Déroulède himself following his exile. Just as the League struggled to maintain a place in the political landscape of the post-Dreyfus era, Déroulède was faced with the problem of exerting control from a distance. In exile, Déroulède was detached from what was happening on the ground in Paris, where Galli and other leaders were learning the importance of collaborating with other leagues, factions, and parties. Déroulède sought to maintain the purity of the League's plebiscitary Republican program and to distinguish it from its former anti-Dreyfusard allies, including the anti-Semites and the Royalists. The duel with Buffet must be read in this context. And contemporary observers certainly did. From the start of the affair, observers commented that Déroulède's actions had more to do with what was going on in 1901 than what had happened in 1899. Le Soir suggested as early as March 1st that Déroulède was trying to distance himself from the Royalists in an effort to increase the credibility of the Ligue des Patriotes. 2 days later, Le Soir floated a conspiracy theory that the Waldeck-Rousseau government was planning to falsely associate the nationalists with the Royalists, and that Déroulède, forewarned, was attempting to prevent this. As the weeks wore on, Déroulède's former allies grew increasingly impatient with his actions, even nationalist allies. Le Figaro reported that in alienating the Royalists with his recent statements, Monsieur Déroulède has at the same time displeased all the other nationalists, citing recent articles by Edouard Drumont and Henri Rochefort, highly critical of the exiled nationalist. Some observers went so far as to openly question what was going on. Consider the perplexed tone of an article published in the Royalist La Gazette de France on March 4th. After printing the complete text of Déroulède's first letter to Galli, directing him to go to Brussels and set up a duel with Buffet, the author proceeded to explain that the newspaper had not printed the communication initially because they thought it was fake. It was unbelievable to them that Déroulède would proceed in this manner. What convinced them was the fact of Galli and Dumont's trip to Brussels. While the expressed doubts of the staunchly royalist Gazette de France probably had more to do with their own political agenda than any sort of epistemological crisis in the era of mass media, it's worth using this as a jumping-off point to think a little bit about what is real. Many scholars have explored the advancements in printing technology, extension of transportation infrastructure, and rise in literacy that enabled the development of a truly mass press, and the ways in which this mass press meant that people's experiences of their lived reality was mediated by printed words and images. During the Dreyfus Affair, the mass press was mobilized by Dreyfusards and very successfully by anti-Dreyfusards to create virtual spaces of sociability and exchange. For example, the December 1898 Henri subscription, in which subscribers and editors engaged in a complex and multi-directional communication. As the anti-Dreyfusard leagues fell into backbiting and mutual recrimination, the coalition of the anti-Dreyfusard press, too, crumbled. What remained, though, was this virtual reality inherited from the affair, a space in which narratives could be advanced and arguments put forward that existed alongside or even in contradiction with objective reality. To be perfectly reductive, the anti-Dreyfusards of all stripes thrived on alternative facts. Déroulède's exile and Guérin's imprisonment paradoxically enhanced the power of this virtual reality, even as they diminished the real power of the leagues. Anti-Dreyfusard leagues embraced what Kevin Passmore calls an ethos of force, expressed in public displays of violence or potential violence, advocacy of physical culture and sports, and insistence on leaders' personal and physical charisma. After 1900, these displays of force migrated from the streets to the page in published speeches, statements, letters, and articles. The imagined community created by the anti-Dreyfusard press persisted, but with far more left to the imagination. In 1899, a nationalist or nationalist sympathizer could go and hear Déroulède speak against parliamentary republicanism, or they could read about it the next day. But 2 years later, reading was the only option. As Robert Nye, Edward Berenson, Andrea Mansker, and others have demonstrated, the duel was central to the maintenance of an honor culture that provided a bulwark against threats to bourgeois male identity and hegemony in the Third Republic. Dueling was even more significant within the ethos of force of the radical right. As Passmore writes, radical nationalists loved dueling and prided themselves on their readiness to wield the sword on behalf of the people. Of course, it would have been uncommon for observers to go and watch a duel. Before 1900, however, the public physical presence of the leagues and their leaders tethered accounts of their dueling prowess to real life. Once Déroulède ceased for most of his supporters to functionally exist outside of the pages of the press, his actions assumed an air of semi-reality. Little wonder, then, that the Buffet-Déroulède duel, occurring far from the French border and carried out by two men who had not set foot in France for over a year, seemed unreal. The minute descriptions of places, scenes, and travel served to ground the event, making it real in the same way that Galli and Dumontet's trip made the conflict real for the Gazette de France. Now, Déroulède did actually fight one highly publicized duel in exile. In 1904 against Jaurès, whose newly founded newspaper L'Humanité published an article about the Talama affair containing a joke about Déroulède's short temper. Déroulède, big surprise there. Déroulède escalated the spat by calling Jaurès the most odious perverter of conscience and implying that he was disloyal to France, to which Jaurès responded by calling his seconds. Of course. As with the duel with Buffet, the political mixed with the personal, Déroulède admitted that what motivated his response was not the joke at his expense, but Jaurès's political positions. Again, two logistical matters held up the settling of accounts. Spanish authorities, like the Swiss, in 1901 issued a statement forbidding the duel on Spanish soil. But in this case, rather than calling the matter off, Jaurès petitioned the French president to allow Déroulède to pass into France for a 24-hour period so that the duel could proceed. On December 6, 1904, Déroulède stepped onto French soil for the first time in 5 years, fired one shot at 25 paces, and returned back into exile. The next year, the 5 exiles were amnestied, and they re-entered France yet again. But as they did, they found themselves as a part of yet another reality, one very different from the one they had left. I'd say it's the unreality of the living monument, whom events have now left behind. Thank you.